we go. All right. Good morning, everybody. If you get your questions, go ahead and post them. Should be below the video if you're on a smaller screen. To the right of the video if you're on a larger screen. All right. Let's see if we got some questions in there. There we go. Okay. So we'll start here with Steve. So Steve says, actually, let me get back to my other screen here. All right, there we go. All right, so Steve says, "Hi Q, can you demonstrate how to properly release the wrist in the downswing? Do you let momentum and club weight naturally unhinge, or do you forcibly flip the wrist to release the lag?" It's really both, right? So the club's going to have momentum, right? That's going to release the club, but then you're also going to be, you're going to be actually actively releasing the club. The thing I would try to understand here is that what you feel and what's actually happening are usually two different things, right? So you may feel you may need to feel like you're not actively unhinging the club, but in the reality you will be, right? So that's kind of what I'd be looking at, right? So golf is a game of adjusting your feel to get the desired result that you want. So if you're coming into contact and you're looking like this, right? And you're actively trying to release the club, then you may need to feel like you're not releasing the club at all, right? So that's really what it's about, is adjusting your feel to get the desired result that you want. What's literally happening is, yes, there is momentum of the club. There is, some physics going on that's releasing the club, right? But there's also going to be actively unhinging of the club as well. That's literally what's happening. But what you may actually need to do or need to feel can be two different things, right? So basically, what's going on is when we start our downswing, we want to increase the lag or maintain the lag to this lead arm parallel position, right? That's talked about in the top speed lag course, how we can do that. And then from here, this is where the release starts, right? So what's going to be happening is my wrist is going to be starting to release out the club, right? So I'm going to be losing these angles as I'm coming in, right? And now as I come into impact, right, I'm going to have some shaftling on impact. I'm still going to have a little bit of lag, and then I'm going to fully release that club out in front. So that's this motion here. So this is essentially happening. I'm lagging, and then this is starting to happen. But if you pair that with kind of moving down to the ball, right, then I'm going to release it out in front. Now, if you have an early release, there's usually two reasons, one of two reasons for this, or both of these reasons. It's usually because you're coming down steep and you're reacting to that club coming down steep. So you stand up out of it in order to shallow out the club, right? So what that means is if I'm coming down steep like this, right, then I can stand up out of it, right? So if I'm like this, I can stand up out of it. Look what happens to the club. Now that club shallows out, but I have to release the club early to get the club to the ball, right? Because if I were to stand up out of it and then have, be standing up out of it and then have lots of shaftling, well, I'm not going to get down to the ball, right? So I have to release that club to get it down to the ball, to get to zero the gap between, my chest and the ball. So that would be a reason. And also, when we stand up out of it, our body is going to stall. That's where those physics come in, get involved, where that's going to make me release the club sooner, right? When the body stops rotating, when it decelerates too much, the club's going to release, right? So if you imagine if I have this club like this, and then I start swinging it, and then I just suddenly grab my arm, that club's going to do that, right? The momentum of the club is going to release. So if I'm coming down and I stop my rotation and move my chest away, that club's going to tend to want to release, right? So if you're struggling with the release, struggling to get that club to release properly, I probably work on getting that club in a better position coming down, work on getting that club shallowing out as you're coming down. And we'll talk about, what you would go to work on to do that. The other piece is the club face is open, right? So if my club face is open, I'm going to tend to release it to square it up, right? So what we want to understand is that release closes the face where lag opens the face, right? So if I have this face open, right, and I keep lag on it, that face is going to stay open, right? If I have this face open and then I release it, well, look what I can do. I can square up the face, right? So I need to have this face more square as I'm coming in, so that way I can have my hands in front. Because if let's say I had this face square and then I released it, well, now I'm going to close it too much, right? So that's why when you look at players in the downswing, and if you've been on office hours, I almost say this probably every single office hours. When the club is parallel to the ground in the downswing, I've never seen any player that plays for a living, right, that has this club face pointing up to the sky in any way, right? That club face on a normal shot where they're trying to take a full swing. Now, maybe like a wedge shot, like a bunker shot, yeah, sure, you're going to see that club face open as it's coming down because they're trying to have it open. But for a shot where they're trying to compress the ball, right, they're trying to hit a stock, solid, compressed iron shot, driver, whatever it is, that club face is going to be angled down to the ground in some amount, right? Sometimes it's very little, sometimes it's a little bit more, right? It's usually going to be somewhere between straight up and down or just slightly angled down and, pretty closely matching the posture or a little bit even close to the posture sometimes. Like a Victor Hovland has that club face pretty closed as he's coming down. You have to have a lot of shaftling to be able to support a very shut face because remember, lag opens up the face. So if you have the club face very closed, you got to have a lot of lag at impact. And that's exactly what Victor Hovland has, right? But if I have this club face open here coming down, if I have this club face pointing up to the sky in any way, I got to get this club face closed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to release it to square it up. And so basically what you're doing in both of those situations where you're standing up out of it, and then when you stand up out of it, that causes an early release, or the face is open, so you early release it to square it up. In both of those situations, you're releasing the club as a means to hit a functional golf shot. If you actually released it out in front, right, and released it later, it would lead to a very bad golf shot. It would lead to most likely a shot that would go way, way to the right. So a lot of times you're doing things as a function of trying to get the ball to go toward the target. So what we have to do is we have to set you up to be able to do the things that you want to do in the swing, stay in your posture, have the lag at impact and that sort of thing, by virtue of shallowing out the club and having that club face more square. So if you're struggling with the straight line release course, you're working through that, you've worked through everything else. Maybe you've got great lag in the downswing, everything looks good, but then as you come down to impact, you just have that early release, you stand up out of it. What I would recommend doing is working through the 20-minute shallowing fix course, because that's going to help you to, one, get the face more closed, and two, get the club shallowing to encourage you to be able to release the club more out front. So that's what I would recommend doing if you struggle with that. So to get to that course, you can click the instruction tab and then the 20-minute shallowing fix from there. All right, let's keep going. So Glenn S says, "Hi Q, would you talk through where at address the end of the club shaft should be point for the driver versus high irons, hybrids, and if there's a difference, why? Thanks." There really is no one place where these clubs have to point, to be honest. It doesn't really matter. The ball does not care what your setup looks like. It really does not care. It only cares about how you present the club to it at impact. That's all it cares about. So your setup should be geared toward doing that. And it can be different. The further you get away from impact, the more you're going to see differences between golfers, right? The further you get away from impact, the more you're going to see differences between the best players, right? The closer you get to impact, the more similarities that you're going to see, right? So basically, from here down to the ball, you're going to see a lot of similarities in the best players, whether it's LPGA, LIV, or PGA, whatever. the best players, that's what you're going to see a lot more similarities. But you will see a lot of different things at setup. Like John Rahm, for example. John Rahm stands very close to the ball. John Rahm is like this. This is what John Rahm is like, right? Bryson, he's like this, right? Vastly, way different setups. I mean, not even close to the same. But when you look at them at club parallel to the ground, they're going to look way more similar, right? So here's what I would say as a starting point. All right. Basically, what we want to do in our setup is we just want to be able to move athletically in the backswing. So what we would have is we'd have a little bit of knee flex, right? Because we don't want to be straight-legged like this. This isn't going to be very athletic, and we don't want to be like this where we're too much flex, because then we're going to tend to move out of it, right? If there was a bear running at you, right? How would you kind of be standing there so that way you could react, right? You wouldn't have your legs dead straight, and you wouldn't be down in a big squat like this. You would have a little bit of flex in your knees so that way you can move athletically. It's no different in the golf swing, right? So we want to have a little bit of flex in the knees, and we're going to relax our shoulders. Relax your shoulders, let your arms kind of hang down. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a little bit of flex in the knees, and then we're going to relax our shoulders, and we're just going to hinge from the waist and let our arms kind of hang down until they're roughly about 5-6 inches in front of my body, right? And then I'm just going to grab the club, right? So you can see where that's pointing. This is a good starting point. Now, as far as is it going to be different for driver, for irons? Yes, the clubs are shorter, right, for irons, and they're much longer for driver, right? So here I would be for like irons, right? So this would be a pretty, a textbook kind of setup. And if you look for driver, because it's such a longer club, I'm actually going to be standing a little bit more upright, and my hands are going to reach out just a little bit more. So this is what I would be, for driver, right? This would be like the driver setup. Now, as far as from the face-on perspective, where is the club pointing? Is it pointing more forward, more back, more in the middle? A lot of that's going to depend on your grip. So typically, if you have a stronger grip, you're going to tend to have more of the hands more forward at address, because it's going to tend to be more comfortable for you to have your hands more forward, right? So a stronger grip where my lead hand's more on top, right? And my trail hand is more under, right? If I hold the club like this with a very, very strong grip, this would be a very strong grip. If I hold the club like this, it's just way more comfortable for me to have my hands more in front and have the club kind of pointing more toward my left hip here, right? If I have a weak grip where my left hand's more on the side and my trail hand's more on the side, my hands are more on the side of the grip, right? Well, this is the most comfortable place for me to hold the club, right? This is where I'm going to move athletic. Now, it doesn't mean that if I have a weak grip, I have to have my hands here. I can have my hands here, with a weak grip as well, right? And that's completely fine. If I have a very strong grip, I can have my hands here. Now, it's very uncomfortable for me to do that, but I can. It's way more comfortable for me to have my hands ahead. So that's kind of the way that I would look at it. It's not about making sure, okay, I need to have this pointed perfectly at my belt buckle or whatever, right? It's more about how can I set up that allows me to get to here, right? The impact position that I want to be in. Because that's the most important part. That's really the only thing that matters, is the impact position that you're in, right? So setup in whatever way allows you to be able to do that. So that means just play around with your setup, right? If you set up closer to the ball and that helps you to get into a much, much better position at impact, then by all means do that. If you set up farther away from the ball, it helps you get into a better position at impact, then by all means do that. There's no one, you have to have the club pointed here, because it only matters how you get the club to the ball, right? So I would only change your setup if it positively influences how you're getting into your impact position. That's the way I would think about it. All right, let's keep going. All right. So Charles L says, I'm hitting thin shot after thin shot following the shallowing training. I'm worse now than I started before. I'm either too steep or I'm standing up. Help, please. So that's pretty normal. When you start to shallow out the club, it can also affect the bottom of your swing. So let's talk about what actually causes thin shots. Thin shots are from the bottom of your swing arc being at or before the ball, right? So if my fist is the ball and I'm hitting the ball this way, and this is my swing arc, right? So the club comes down on an arc. If that club is bottoming out where the ball is or before, I'm going to tend to hit it thin. The reason is that let's say I hit the ground with the bottom of the swing before the ball. Again, I'm hitting this way, right? Well, I'm hitting the ground way back here. That's going to be a chunk, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tend to come down and kind of miss the ground as much as I can, and then I'm going to tend to actually hit up on the ball, and that's going to lead to low strikes on the face, right? Because I don't have any space underneath the ball. The only way I can really hit it solid would be if the ball is basically on a tee, or the ball is like sitting up on the grass like it's on a tee. So there's like a little bit of a buffer area below the ball where it can bottom out and not really provide a lot of resistance to the club, right? So what we need is we need the bottom of the swing arc to be in front of and slightly below the ball, right? So in front of a few inches and slightly below the ball. That's going to allow me to make a downward, motion into the ball with the club, make ball first contact. Then I'm going to get into the turf, right? I'm going to take a divot, and then it's going to come up out of the turf, right? So how does shallowing affect that? Well, if I shallow the club, think about it this way. If I'm standing at home plate at a baseball field and I I excessively shallow out the club, so it's way, way back behind me, and I swing 45 degrees out to the right, so I'm swinging directly toward first base. My club is going to bottom out more toward my trail foot. It's going to bottom out more in this area. On the other side of that, if I'm coming down steeply and over the top, right, I'm swinging toward third base, right, my club's going to bottom out more in front. So if you're someone who your whole life you've come down steep or you've been coming down steep for a long time, what is likely happening is you more than likely hang back in your swing is a way to help you to make good ground contact. Because if you were to really shift your weight forward, right, get your body forward and come over the top, well, you would the bottom of your swing would be too far forward. You would not hit good shots. You would hit worse shots, right? So what a lot of people will do is when they come over the top and steep, they'll actually kind of hang back in the swing to get the ground contact to happen where the ball is, right? So if I do that same thing, if I hang back in my swing like I'm used to doing, but then I also shallow out the club, then I'm going to tend to hit the ground behind the ball. So a steep swing pairs well with a poor weight shift, right? A shallow swing pairs well with a good weight shift. So what I would make sure that you're doing is you're visualizing that arc of the club coming down, and you're getting that body forward, right? You're getting your weight forward to hit to be able to make ball first contact. So that's what I'd be focusing on. You could also be excessively shallowing out the club, right? So if you go back to my prior example where I talked about swinging toward first base, that's excessive, right? 45 degrees out to the right. So now obviously that'd be very, very difficult to do, to literally swing 45 degrees out to the right. But if you're swinging 10, degrees out to the right, 8 degrees out to the right, that's excessive. That's too much, right? So you may need to just kind of tone it down. So working through getting to drill number 3, after you've got the hooks, right, that start the right curve to the left, and when you work through drill number 3, that may work out the thin shots. But let's say you're shallowing it out a good amount, the amount that we want to, right? Then what's likely happening is you're probably hanging back in the swing, which is leading to the the issues that you're talking about. So make sure that you're getting a good weight shift to the lead side. A good drill that I really like. So typically, when people are struggling with ground contact, there's usually 2 drills that I have them do, because it's usually one or both of these things. So one is that in the backswing, the hips typically tend to slide, or we get loaded up too much on our trail side too late, right? So we want to load up very early on the trail side and then actually start moving into the lead side as we get up to the top, right? So the chair drill is something that I really like to give students because this really gives you some good feedback on whether you're sliding your hips. So the way you would do this drill is you'd start out, you would have your hips basically touching the chair to start with. And then as you start the swing, you're going to bump the chair. The reason why you bump the chair is to shift pressure into your right foot right away, right in the beginning of the swing. I find a lot of people don't do that, right? And that's the most athletic way to swing it. If you look very closely at a lot of pro players, what you're going to see is you're going to see a very slight move of the hips away from the target to start the backswing, right? Now, they're not sliding their hips. They're just nudging their hips to the right. So if I have my hips against the chair and then I just nudge it a little bit, that's putting pressure into my right foot. And then I'm going to push my hips back and around, right? And at the top of the swing, I should be able to fit my hand snugly between my hips in the chair, right? So if I'm here and then I go up to the top, right? So now you can see I can fit my hand between my hips in the chair. That means that I'm getting my hip to move back and around, and I'm getting my hips to move, my momentum of my hips to move toward the target slightly. And then I'm going to continue that in the downswing. So when people come down steep, or when people struggle to get their ground contact, a lot of times what's happening here is they start their backswing, and then as they get up to the top, they're actually moving into the chair. And now I'm just too much on my trail side, right? I have a long way to go to get to my lead side. And I'm actually at a mechanical disadvantage to move into my lead side because my leg has gotten more vertical, right? If my leg gets very vertical, then it's hard for me I don't have as much leverage to push into my lead side. If my leg is more at an angle, I have more leverage to push in that direction, right? So, and then also, if my leg is more vertical and my hips are more this way, I have a lot farther of a distance to go to get my hips to my lead side. So what I want to do is I want to have it a little nudge to load up, get that hip moving back and around. My leg's going to be at an angle. I'm also going to have some momentum moving this way. And I'm also not going to have as far to go this way in the downswing. And now I'm going to more easily be able to get to my lead side and get to where I want to go. So the chair drill is a really good one for that. So that'd be one that I would recommend. And then another one would be the step drill. So the step drill is where you start out with your feet together, right? Start with the club in front. And you're not doing this hitting balls. You're just getting the sensation of pushing to your lead side in the backswing. This really helps you to do that. So we're going to start with our feet together, club in front. I'm going to apply pressure into my trail foot. I'm going to start swinging this club back as my hands clear my legs, right? That's why I'm going to start my step, right? So I'm here, hands in front of the legs, hands in front of the legs. Now my hands have cleared my legs. Now I'm going to start my step, and I'm going to time the step landing when I reach the top of the swing, right? So I'm here, I'm going to time that step. Now I'm at the top of the swing. Now from here, you can see how I've really moved my momentum forward. I forced myself to do that because I'm doing a step, right? And then from there, I'm going to push into the ground and come all the way around into a full finish. It's very difficult when you do this correctly to hang back in the swing. So it's a great way to give you the proper sensation of moving into your lead side. I would think about it this way. If I were to throw a ball as powerfully as I can, right, I'm not going to throw it like this, right? But that's what a lot of people do in the golf swing. That's the equivalent of going up to the top of the swing like this and making the downswing like that, right? That's the equivalent of throwing a ball where I'm shifting my weight in my trail side, and then I'm going to do that. That's not going to be very powerful. What I want to do is I want to have my arm going back as my body's moving forward. So that way, when I'm landing, right, now I've got all my momentum moving forward, and I'm pushing into the ground with my lead side to really open up my body to be able to fling this ball, right? So it's the same thing in the golf swing. I want to be here, right? I've loaded up. Now I want to, this is the equivalent from here of moving my arm back as I'm moving forward. And now I've got pressure into my lead side. And now I can really unleash and feel that power that I'm used to having. So that's what I had to do, the step drill. And then from there, again, not hitting balls yet, I would do practice swings where you're replicating that same feeling. So pressure right foot and then moving pressure into left foot, pushing the ground and come around. Once you're able to do that, then you add the golf ball. But those would be the 2 drills that I would recommend doing if you're struggling to get to your lead side while doing the shallowing drills, because odds are you're probably coming down steep and hanging back in the swing. Now you're shallowing it and you're still hanging back in the swing. So we got to learn to get our body forward when we're shallowing it as well. All right, let's keep the questions coming here. So Tom S says, for a right-handed golfer, when does the right arm straighten in the golf swing? Hitting consistently close to the shaft and may arm looks pretty straight and wondering if causing the club to push out and causing more of heel impact, if that makes sense. Yeah, so basically that's happening about halfway down the downswing. So when we get up to the top of the swing, when we start the downswing, that trail arm typically stays the same amount bent to about this lead arm parallel position. Then gradually from there, it will start to straighten out. Now, there are some players that have a pretty straight arm at impact. And there are some players that have a very bent arm at impact. So like Dustin Johnson would have a very bent arm at impact. And then there are some players that have a little bit more of a straight arm at impact. Neither one of them is necessarily wrong. I would say most likely if you are struggling with heel strikes, it's usually not because the right arm is straightening out too quickly. It's usually because your hips are moving toward the ball, right? So in the downswing, your hips move out toward the ball. You don't have any space for the club to work through. So when my hands work out away from me, right? I don't have any space for my hands to work through, so that may push the club to go out a little bit. So what I would try to do is feel like you're creating space with the hips for your hands to work through. And then I would pair that with the feeling of intentionally trying to hit the ball off the toe, right? So I really try to feel like you're flexing those hips to start the downswing. A lot of times early extension is what causes the heel strikes because we're going like this, right? And when I do that, that's going to tend to take away the space. So feel like you're flexing those hips to start the downswing, right? And then have the intention of actually hitting the ball off the toe. Because right now you're trying to hit it in the center of the face. If you're not, then you should be trying to hit the ball in the center of the face. I'd first try that. But let's say you are trying to hit the ball in the center of the face, but the reality is that you're hitting it in the heel. Then what I would do is I would change your intention to hitting it off the toe. And what that will do is it will more than likely move the strike more to the center of the face. If it's still in the heel, then exaggerate it more. Feel like you're hitting it out here on the edge. If you actually start consistently hitting the ball on the toe a little bit, then tone down the feeling to get it more in the center of the face. As I mentioned before, golf is a game of adjusting your feel to get the desired result that you want, right? If we could just swing with our intention all the time and our feel was perfectly right on all the time, we would just hit the perfect shots every single time. But we know nobody does that, right? Even the best players in the world don't. They might have a couple shots around where they hit it absolutely perfectly the way that they videoed it or pictured it in their mind, right? Usually it's going to be a little off. Now obviously the better players, they're going to be less off than because they have more control of those things, but recreational golfers are typically going to be a little bit more off. So what we have to learn to do is adjust our feel to get the desired result that we want, right? So if you're trying to hit the ball in the center of the face, but you're consistently hitting it off the heel, changing your feel to a toe strike will likely move those strikes more in the center of the face. And then if you actually start hitting the ball off the toe consistently, at that point, you can tone down that feeling. And that goes for anything, right? So let's say you're hitting the ground 2 inches behind the ball, but you're trying to hit the ground where the ball is. Try to hit the ground 2 inches in front of the ball, right? Let's say that you're trying to shallow out the club, but you're actually coming down steep. Feel like you're shallowing out the club too much, right? So all of these things, all these feel things, apply to all the variables. All right, let's keep going here. So Paul F says, "Hi Q, I was hitting my driver and 3-wood fairly well and was not hitting my irons well. And now it's reversed. I'm hitting the driver in 3-wood, topping them. Can't figure it out. Thanks. So what I would do first is if you're topping them, then if you're topping them, it just means you're hitting it off the bottom of the club, right? So the first thing I do is I just try to hit the ball high on the face, right? What we have to understand is, this is fairly common what you're talking about, hitting your driver well, but then the iron's terrible, and then vice versa. It's fairly common because a lot of people have this idea that you're going to have the same exact intention with all of the shots. That's not really what's happening, right? So with an iron, what we're doing is the ball position is going to be more toward the middle of the stance, right? Just forward of the middle of the stance usually. And because we're hitting these shots off of the ground, we need to have a downward movement of the club into the ball, right? So it can't be working up into the ball because the ground is in the way. We need to have a downward movement in the ball. So that's dictated by the ball position. It's also dictated by your intention, right? So for an iron, I'm typically going to have a little bit of a narrower stance. I'm typically going to have my body more forward as I come into impact. So that way I can get the bottom of my swing to happen a few inches in front of the ball. And that's going to promote a downward angle of attack into the ball, right? So that's going to be this, right? Now with a driver, I don't want to hit a driver like that, right? If I hit a driver like that, it's going to be really low, right? I'm not going to get very much distance. It's going to have a lot of spin on it. I don't want to do that with the driver. I want my driver to launch high. I want it to have low spin, and all those things. So that way it can go farther, right? So I'm going to have a different intention with my driver. My ball position is going to be pushed forward, right? So if I grab the driver here, just so we're not to avoid any confusion. With the driver, my ball position is going to be more forward. I'm also going to widen my stance a little bit. Why would I do that? Because it's going to help me to stay behind the ball. If I was like this with my driver, it's going to be a lot easier to get my body too far forward. I can lean out into it. I'm going to tend to hit down on it. But if I'm like this, I can push away a lot easier to stay behind the ball to promote an upward angle of attack on the ball. So I'm going to take a wider stance. My ball position is going to be more forward, and I'm going to tee the ball up, right? I'm also hitting the ball in a different place in my arc, right? So for a driver, I actually need to shallow out the club more, right? The reason being is that the ball position is more forward, right? So if we imagine how this club works around our body in an arc, right? It works around so the club's working into out, into out, into out, into out, turns the corner, then works out to in, out to in, out to in, right? Because it's coming down on an incline arc like this, right? Well, if my ball position is here for my iron, right? That's perfect because that's going to be coming in. It's going to be turning the corner. But if I shallowed out the club, if I shallow out the club the exact same way with the driver as I do with the iron, now my ball position's up here. Now my path is working to the left by the time it gets to the ball, right? So that would mean, okay, if I swing the exact same way, I'm going to hit my irons great, but I hit my driver, yanks to the left, maybe pull hooks, maybe slices, things like that. So what I need to do with the driver is I actually need to get my path. I need to shallow out the club more. So that way, by the time the club gets to the ball, it's at a fairly neutral path. It's turning the corner at the ball, and that's going to allow me to hit the ball relatively straight. So what I would do to help with your, the discrepancy between how well you hit your irons and your driver is think about exactly what you're trying to do with both, right? With the iron, I need to have a descending blow at the ball. I need to shallow out I need the club to have a neutral arc at the ball, which means I'm going to need to have a certain amount of shallowing, right? With the driver, I'm going to be hitting up on the ball. I'm going to miss the ground. I'm going to hit up on the ball, right? So I need to be a little bit wider. I need to be a little bit more angled away as I'm coming in. I need to have the club arcing a little bit, feel of arcing a little bit more to the right as it's coming in. So that way it's more neutral at the ball. So think about the intentions that you're having with the clubs, and you'll be much more successful with both. And it's not something. I think people have this idea that we're going to be robots, right? And we're just going to step up to the ball and you just push a button and we just make the same swing every single time and we're just going to be consistent. But that's not really how it works. What I would try to be is try to be more athletic with it, right? And understand it's like a basketball player, right? When Steph Curry is coming up and he's trying to figure out what he needs to do. He's not doing the same thing every time. He's reading what the defender is doing, and that's dictating. He's reading what the defense is doing, and that's dictating what he does, right? So he might look at the defender and he may be reacting and know, okay, well, I got to step to the right and take this three. Or, maybe the defender is coming too much up on him and it's like, okay, well, I'm going to try to go by this guy and get to the basket or be able to. And then when he's getting to the basket, he's thinking, okay, do I have an open layup here? Do I have a chance to lay it in? Or such and such is open in the corner and I can dish it to them, right? He's being athletic with what he's doing. It's not, he has an idea of what he's going to do before he's going to do it, but there are decisions. There's basically a decision matrix that he goes through as he's doing it. So it's not like he just pushes button like shoot three, right? But I think people have this idea of that's what we're going to do when we play golf. No, we're going to have decisions to make, right? When when you step up on the tee box, maybe the tee box is a little different than the last one. Not everything is exactly the same, right? Maybe the tee box is like angled weird, right? And that's a pet peeve. I hate that when that happens because it like throws you all off. So you have to be aware of that. Maybe the tee box is like a slightly downhill. It's not always perfect, surfaces, right? Maybe when you get to your second shot, right, your approach shot, it's in a little bit of a divot. So we have to react. We have to do different things on every shot. So what we have to understand is what it takes to hit a good shot. What it takes ball first contact. It takes center face contact. It takes the club working into the ball on the correct arc. It takes the club face being in a certain direction, right? To dictate where it goes, right? We have to control those variables, and then it takes speed, right? To apply the energy into the ball, right? So those are the variables that we're working with. You could even add in variables for I want to hit it high, I want to hit it low. So I need to have more shaft lean for low, less shaft lean for high, right? There's all kinds of things that's why golf, I think, is one of the most difficult and most addicting games, is because of all the variables that are out there. And people are looking for the cookie cutter robotic thing that I need to do. I know I'm kind of going off on a tangent. I'm not trying to pick on anybody or Paul or anybody like that. I'm just trying to say we want to think about it in this certain way. I'm not saying that Paul is thinking that he's a robot or anything like that. It's just that I think that people are looking for, they're looking for consistency when, what their mind set of consistency is that I just want to get over the ball and feel like I can just get the ball to go where I want it to go. But what we need to think about is to be consistent, you really just need to control those variables, right? You need to be able to adjust those variables, the variables of where you're hitting the ground, how the club's arcing down into the ball, where you're striking it on the face, the speed at which you are hitting it, the loft at which you are hitting it. It's about controlling those variables and understanding what you're trying to do, how you're getting the club to interact with the ball. So if you understand that, that's what pros do, right? That's what pros are doing. That's how they go about their business. Is they're hitting a 30-yard chip or pitch with tons of spin is way different than hitting a driver, right? It's way different than hitting an iron because you're trying to do something very different, right? So people tend to be able to think about, okay, well, of course, yeah, that's a very different shot, but you have to think about the difference between an iron and a driver in the same way. Yes, it's a full swing, shot, but they're very different in the sense of what you're trying to accomplish. And iron shot to iron shot, it can be very different. If you have an iron shot on one hole that maybe you have a downhill lie, the pins in the back or whatever, that's going to take a different recipe of things to hit the shot that you want to go. Maybe on the next hole, the ball's a little bit below your feet, and the wind's blowing against you. The wind's blowing in a different direction. The pin's on the front. That's going to take a very different mindset to work through that. So what I would say is to get to where you are more consistent through the bag, right? You want to look at what exactly you're doing with those variables on every shot, right? So again, the variables are where you're hitting the ground, if you're hitting the ground, right? A driver, obviously, we don't want to hit the ground, but for any shot that we hit off of the ground, there's going to be some ground interaction with that, right? We have to get the club to where the ball is, right? So there's going to be some interaction with the ground. Now, it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to take a divot. It just means that there's going to be some interaction with the ground that you're going to have, right? You want to hit the ball in the center of the face. And there might be some situations when you don't want to hit the ball in the center of the face, right? There's some chip shots where it's actually beneficial to hit the ball off the toe because that's the technique that you want to use, right? So, for example, let's say you have a very bare lie, right? The ball is sitting in kind of a bare lie. Well, if you were to sole the club to the ground, a lot of that club is going to be making contact with the ground, and it may dig on you, and it's going to make it more difficult. So in that situation, it would actually be better to kind of stand this club up a little bit and get the toe down the ground so there's less contact with the club with the ground. So it's going to dig less, or it's going to tend to dig less, right? And I may actually open up the face a little bit to expose the bounce. And now I can hit this shot much more consistently because I've thought about how I want this club to interact with the ball, right? So that's the way that you want to go through it. You're going to be way more likely to duff a shot if, let's say, you got the hands way forward. You have a bare lie, you go hands way forward, club sole to the ground. You better hit that perfect, right? You better hit that absolutely. You have zero margin for error on that shot, right? Whereas if I stand the club up and stand a little bit closer to it, put the toe down the ground, play this a little bit off the toe, right? Open up the face a little bit, which allows the bounce to be engaged a little bit so it doesn't dig, right? Now I can hit an inch behind this ball and it's still going to be good, right? I'm giving myself margin for error when I do that. So think about how this club, on every shot, think about how the club is going to interact with the ball, and then you make swings accordingly to that. If you do that, you will have much less variance between your shots, because the driver is you're doing something very different with the driver, right? The swing itself may not be a huge difference, right? But your intention of what you're trying to do with the driver is much different than what you're trying to do with an iron shot, much different than what you're trying to do with the bunker shot, much different than what you're trying to do out of the rough or whatever, right? It's very different. So it's about kind of going through that. All right, let's keep going here. So BJ says, Q, when starting the downswing with irons, excuse me, I noticed you squat down somewhat as your lead leg moves forward. Do you squat down when starting the downswing, driver downswing as well? Yes. So there's going to be some flexing. So when we start our downswing, right, we want to have some flexing of the hips. So what I think a lot of people equate this squatting, they equate this squatting as the knees, right? It's less of the knees, right? Your right knee is going to start to flex a little bit, but your left knee is already going to be flexed, right? So when you go up to the top of the swing, your left leg, your lead leg, is going to add flex and move in. So it's going to be more like that, right? So if you look here, it's going to add flex and it's going to move in. My right leg, my trail leg, is typically going to extend a little bit, right? As far as the knees are concerned, what happens in the downswing is my left leg is either going to maintain flex. When we look at the better players, it's either going to maintain its flex or it's going to add flex, but it's going to bow out, right? So what doesn't happen is to start the downswing, I don't start straightening out that leg right away. It's going to remain flex or add flex, and it's going to bow out, right? So that looks, if you look at my left leg, that's going to look like that, right? So I haven't taken out flex, and I haven't added a ton of flex. I'm either going to maintain the flex or I'm going to add a small amount of flex. Now my right leg in that start of the downswing is going to match that flex of my left leg, right? So I'm going to go here, and then I'm going to match that flex by the time my knees get back to square. Now, when that happens, my hips are also going to flex a little bit, right? So that's really what the squat move is the left leg bowing out and maybe adding a little bit of flex. My right leg adding, matching the flex of my left leg by knees back to square. And then my hips are going to flex in the start of the downswing. So again, that looks like this, right? So that's really what the squat move is. When I see people try to do this squat move, typically what I see is this, right? Where the hips actually kind of tuck under and the knees go forward a lot. This is what people equate to the squat move, right? And this it really isn't going to help you to do anything, right? So what we want is this. So you can see how I'm flexing my hips. I'm doing this, right? I'm making the angle between my legs and my upper body smaller. That's flexing the hips, right? That's what starts the downswing. If we straighten everything out to start the downswing, which was something that I see a lot of recreational golfers do, it's referred to as early extension. Typically, what's going to happen is we're going to early release the club. We're going to have a hard time controlling face and path because the club face is going to tend to roll over very quickly. Now, what we have to understand is that it's not usually as simple as, okay, I'm just going to start squatting the downswing. Because usually what happens is people are straight early extending to help them hit a better shot, right? Meaning they're coming down steep and then doing this gets that club shallowed out, right? So what we have to understand is that there's typically other variables that have to change to incentivize you to stay in your posture and flex the knees and the hips in the start of the downswing, right? So if you're struggling with that, if you find that you're not able to do that move, you're kind of straightening out in your body in the start of the downswing, I'd recommend the 20-minute shallowing fix because that's going to help you to get those variables working in your favor. They're going to incentivize you to start, staying in your posture, flexing your knees and your hips because we don't have any incentive to do so if the club is not in a shallow position coming down. Because let's say this club is coming down steep, and then in the start of the downswing, and I flex my knees, and I rotate. Well, look what that club's just going to come down even more steep, right? So we have to have those, the more we want to rotate the body, the more we have to shallow out the club. So if we're already coming down steep, and then you're trying to rotate the body when you're already coming down steep, it's just going to come down even steeper, right? And it's going to make things even more difficult for you. So that's why people have trouble, I don't like to see people just start trying to rotate the body open. I get a lot of students that come to me like, I can't get my hips open. I've been trying to get my hips open. When reality is you shouldn't be just trying to get your hips open. You should be trying to set yourself up in a position to be able to be incentivized to get your hips to open. And then from there, you can work on getting the hips to open, right? And a lot of times, if you set yourself up in a position to be incentivized to get the hips open, you will do it naturally. A lot of times, not always, but a lot of times you will do it naturally. Meaning you won't need to think about it in order to do it. All right, so let's keep going. Paul F says, thank you for the good explanation. No problem, Paul. Glad to help. Let's keep going here. So Dean S says, hi, new to the system. Great programs, by the way. Thanks, Dean. Appreciate that. I've noticed a shank appearing when I'm aiming my elbows at the ball for lag. I think I might be pulling across too much rather than down. Can this cause the issue? I think the club may be traveling outside the cone. Yeah, so if you come down steep and over the top, usually, most likely what's happening is that when you try to lag the club, the face is very open. and you're kind of leading with the hosel, and that could be causing the shanks, right? So if I'm coming down, this face is open like this, I'm kind of leading with the hosel. This is what's coming at the ball, right? So what I mentioned earlier is that lag opens the face while release closes the face, right? And release would be losing the lag, right? So um, if you're used to kind of releasing it and that release squares up the face, well, when you get lag, that opens the face, and now I'm leading with the hosel, right? So that's more than likely what's going on. What I would say is when you're getting lag, I would make sure that you're not doing so by virtue of cupping your lead wrist, right? If you're excessively cupping that lead wrist, that opens up the club face. Yes, you can get more lag doing that, but that's not the way that you want to get lag, right? So from an anatomical standpoint, if I have my wrist cupped like this, right? So the knuckles are kind of going back toward me, I can actually get this club to hinge a lot more, right? So if I have this wrist flat, that's how much I can hinge it. If I can cup it, I can hinge it more. If I bow it, I do it less, right? So that's why a lot of people have trouble with keeping the wrist kind of flat or even bowing the wrist, because it doesn't load up the club as much. It doesn't lag. It doesn't allow you to hinge the club as much as what you're used to, and it's going to feel less powerful when you do that, right? So what I would make sure of is that when you're getting this club to lag, you're not doing so by cupping the wrist a ton, because when I do that, watch what happens to the club face. If I have a flat wrist and then I cup it, see what that does to the club face. And if I'm doing that to create lag, that this is how I'm coming into the ball, that's going to be leading with the hosel. So I'd make sure that that club face is in a better position as you're coming down, right? So I kind of look at yourself on video and see, okay, am I cupping the wrist? How's this club face coming down? Is the club face open like this? And if it is, you're going to release it to square it up. And when you do that, you're going to tend to shank it, right? So I'd make sure that that club face is in a better position, so that way you can keep turning through. The other thing that I would say is that I would make sure that you have room for things to work through, right? So I try to feel like you're flexing those hips to start the downswing to create room for your hands and your arms and the club to work through. If you're lagging this club and you're moving your hips and you're kind of tucking your hips under and you're moving your hips toward the ball, right? Well, I'm going to have a hard time not shanking it from there because I don't have any space for my arms to work through. So Dina says, okay, that makes sense because my good shots are powerful, but pulls. Yeah. So if you're hitting pulls, then that means that you're coming down steeply, right? So you may be getting lag, but you're coming down over the top and steep, right? So you need to shallow out the club, get that club to work from the inside, push those hips back, right, and make sure that that club face is in a better position as you're coming down. Wanted to know, I do have some spots open for my online lessons. Sending out an email tonight to the members. So if you're interested in working with me doing the online lessons, you click the link above. After tonight, it'll probably be sold out. So if you're interested in working with me, make sure you click the link above the videos here, so that way you can sign up. All right, we got about 5 minutes left here. If we got any more questions. No problem, Dean. Glad to help. So Paul S says, "Are you turning the club face on the way down for irons?" Um, you can, if the club face is already in a good spot as you're coming down, you don't necessarily need to. But there are players that kind of turn it down as they're coming down. So if you look at like a Brooks Koepka, if you look at him at the top, he's like this, and then as he comes down, he kind of bows that wrist more as he's coming down. If you look at Tiger, he's flat at the top, and then as he comes down to about right here, his lead wrist has a little bit of bow in it, and then he kind of releases some of that bow as he's coming down. If you look at some players like a Dustin Johnson has that face very closed at the top, but then he actually undoes some of that as he's coming down. So as he comes down to here, his lead wrist isn't near as bowed, and at impact, it's not near as bowed. So there's lots of ways to do it. What I would say is that if your face is not closed enough at the top, you will need to turn the face down some as you're coming down. If it's closed, then you'll need to release it a little bit. If it's in a good spot, then there isn't any turning down of the club that you need to do. So a lot of it's just going to depend on the position of the face at the top of the swing. Some good checkpoints that I like to see is at the top of the swing, is I like to see that club face a little bit close to the lead arm, right? So if this is my lead arm, you can see how that club face, if I get it in front of the meter here, you can see how that club face is a little bit close to it, right? That would be open to it. That would be probably a little bit too close to it, right? So a little bit close to the forearm is what I'd like to see. So if you look at the leading edge of the club, it's kind of pointing up to the sky, right? Whereas my lead arm is kind of pointing that way. So it's a little bit close to my forearm. If I were to excessively cut my wrist, you can see how that definitely changes the club face, makes it open to my forearm. If I were to bow my wrist a ton, that would have the face very, very close to my forearm, probably too close, right? And I need to kind of undo some of that in the downswing. But generally speaking, a little bit close to the forearm is a good place. Now, as I'm bringing it down to this lead arm parallel position, I like to see this club face angled down toward the ground slightly, right? So it could be, what we see with a lot of players is it kind of it closely matches the back line, right? So club parallel to the ground. If this is my back line right here, like you can see how my back line is kind of angled down toward the ground slightly. The club face will kind of pretty closely match that. Now, it can be a little bit open to that. It can be a little bit closed to that. Keep in mind that the more closed it is to that, the more shaft lean you have to have the face square at impact. Because if you have the face very close to that and then you early release it, you're going to hook everything, right? Now, if this face is more vertical like this, it's going to require less shaft lean at impact to square it up, right? So a lot of times that means if we have the face too open, a lot of players will release it a little bit early. But generally speaking, a little bit close to the forearm here, pretty closely matching the back line here. And then that's going to put you in a good position to bring the club to the ball with a square face and shaft lean. That's what you see in the better players. All right, so we got one more question here from Dan S. Says, been watching another instructor, and he talks about the sweeping of the fairway woods and hybrids. I have been coming down slightly steeper many times, having a small divot. Thoughts, divot, or slightly more sweeping? Well, so a lot of it just depends on the lie. Not all lies are created equal. So if you have a lie where the ball is really sitting up and maybe the ground is hard, right? There's not going to be much of a divot there, right? Now, keep in mind that you're going to have less of a divot for your fairway woods and hybrids because of the way that the club is shaped, right? The club has a sole of the club is flatter, it's more rounded, right? So it's not going to tend to dig into the ground as much. There's also less loft on these clubs, so there's less of a leading edge, which is going to also less. So the club, just because of the geometry of the club, it's not going to tend to dig as much as a wedge, obviously, or even a 7-iron, right? It's not going to dig as much. So you may get some lies where you're kind of more sweeping it, right? And you may get some lies. Let's say you have a very tight lie. The conditions are kind of wet, right? It'd be very difficult to hit that shot really well unless you just have a ton of shaft lean. It'd be difficult to hit that shot solidly if you didn't take some divot, right? So a lot of what's going to dictate whether you take a divot or not is going to be dictated by the lie itself. the ball's sitting up, if it's really dry, if it's hard, there's going to be less of a divot. If it's tight lie, if it's wet, right, those are going to tend to lead toward divots. So it's not a cut and dry. You're going to take a divot or you're not. A lot of it's going to depend on, what your. Also, it's going to depend on how much shaft lean you have. If you don't have a lot of shaft lean, you're going to be more likely to need to take a divot, right? So the reason for that, if you think about it this way, if I grab a ball, right? If I don't have a lot of shaft lean, let's say that this club is kind of straight up and down at impact, right? That's where my contact point is on the face, right? It's very low on the face. So I better be hitting down on the ball to get a divot. Now, if I have shaft lean, if I excessively, let's say I have a ton of shaft lean, look at where the contact point goes, right? So no shaft lean, it's like on the first groove. If I get, let's say I get, 15, 20 degrees of shaft lean here, which would be a lot, right? Now that puts me on like the fifth or sixth groove, right? So if I'm coming in like this, I don't need to have as much of a divot because I have more shaft lean that's going to allow me to get the ball higher on the face. So there's lots of variables there. It's not cut and dry. You take a divot or you don't. It's more about, okay, what I would look at is what I would pay attention to is when you hit a good shot, right? When you hit the ball solidly, and what I would challenge you to do, Dan, is when you hit the ball solidly with your fairway wood or whatever, and you get the result that you want, you hit a good shot. Look at what happened with the ground, what your ground interaction was like, and then look at what kind of lie it is. Okay, was it really firm? Was it a tight lie? Was it a plush lie? And that can kind of give you an idea. And if you keep going through that, you'll realize, okay, on certain shots, certain lies, that this is going to be, I'm going to tend to have a divot, and I'm not going to have a divot otherwise. So, like I said, a lot of times it depends. But all right, thanks everybody for joining me. We'll be back here tomorrow, 3 p.m. Eastern time. Everybody have a great rest of your day, and I will talk to y'all next time.